Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers, where we are looking at the A to Z of PS1 Hidden Gems, games that don't often get talked about for one reason or another. Can you believe it? We are all the way here at the letter Z or Z or however you want to say it, I don't care. I wasn't sure if this would be an easy letter to get games for, but it turns out that there's just enough. And even more surprisingly, the quality is pretty good. Of the games at least, not my video making quality. That will always be low and riddled with mistakes. But hey, that's part of my charm. Anyway, how about I shut up, you press that subscribe button, and we take a look at some games. Let's start with a game that is just called Zed, and apparently yes it is pronounced Zed. Zed is a strategy game where you control an army of robots trying to take control of various planets. The story of course tells you about the red and blue factions who both want to take over for their own purposes, but it's mostly just ignorable. This is a real-time strategy game, but it plays a lot differently to games like Command & Conquer. Here, all the levels are divided into sections and shown on a map. Each section has a flag that you need to capture, and then that is part of your territory. Usually, each section of the map contains something that you then need to control. This might include a soldier building factory, a vehicle building factory, sentry guns, and that sort of thing. The buildings are all automatically built and have their own timers on them that are constantly counting down. When they get to 0, units of whatever colour army currently holds that part of the map are made. So basically, you don't manually create units or vehicles, they're just constantly pumped out on a timer, and who they're for just comes down to whose flag is in the ground. Your objective on pretty much every level is to destroy all the enemy units and capture or destroy their base, but this is definitely a lot easier said than done. The enemy army AI is always super aggressive and quick off the mark. It's unlikely that you'll beat many of the levels on your first try. There's a surprising amount of trial and error here. You'll need to learn which part of the maps to capture first and which units are best to get the job done. You'll get vehicles, and these are vital as they give you a massive speed and power boost, so if you can get them early on you can do a hell of a lot of damage in quite a short time. But make sure you leave troops behind to defend your flags, as to capture them all that needs to be done is someone else touches it. And you can do this when there's enemy units still in the territory. It's literally whoever touches it most recently that gets it. As you get further into the game, more units and vehicles come available, but the challenge never lets up. This is a hard-ass game. Graphically, it looks fine. It's all 2D sprites and doesn't really do anything too special. The cutscenes are cool, pre-rendered ones that look decent enough and have your typical 90s 2D humour, which means they're not funny, but, you know, A for effort. The controls, even with a controller, are fine. Now, you can actually use the PlayStation mouse with this game, but I can't get that to work with my totally legit copy. However, it would make everything infinitely better. Having said that though, even with the controller, it's perfectly playable. There aren't that many functions, as it's just a case of select your units and tell them to attack or capture flags. This means they've used the buttons on the controller to snap to nearest units or enemy bases or their units. It takes a bit of getting used to, but works pretty well when you do. But yeah, the mouse, if it's an option, would be much better. The game does have a pretty slow pace to it, with no option to speed it up that I could see. That was the main problem I have with the game in fact, and it's actually one that I remember having with the PC version when I owned that one years ago. It can make levels feel really like they're dragging, and some will take literal hours to beat thanks to the combo of slow movement and really hard AI. But that shouldn't put you off. If you're up to the challenge, this is a really fun game of what is essentially a massive capture the flag game. If you are into strategy, then I do recommend giving this a go. Fighting game time now, and it's been a while since we've had one of these, it feels like. This is Zero Divide. Zero Divide is very clearly an early 3D fighter for the system, featuring a cast entirely made up of robot fighters. Obviously the developers saw how good Rise of the Robots was on their 16-bit systems and wanted a bit of that sweet action. Though I am at least happy to say that this is better than those games, not that that's saying too much. There is a nonsense story of course, with robots and AI and all that, but it makes no difference here. Then you have a semi-decent roster of 8 characters, each of which has the usual fighting game tropes of the all-rounders, the faster weaker ones and the slower stronger ones. And when I say that, I don't mean it in a bad way, I think it's got to be like that to be fair. The designs of the robots are actually kind of cool. Most of them are humanoid things, and of course there's also a robot with big boobs, because you've got to have that. Most of them are actually all animal-like, with robots looking like scorpions, gorillas, cats, and even a dragon. Each one has their own special moves which are pulled off reasonably easily, which I was surprised at. In fact, the game does kind of feel like Virtua Fighter to me in the way that everyone moves and jumps and attacks. The fights all take place in relatively small arenas, and you can knock your opponent off them, or deplete their life bar to win a round. Best 2 of 3 is the victor. The actual fighting itself can be hit and miss, but it's mostly quite fun. You have an attack button, a block, and a counter. And as mentioned, a few special moves per character that you'll want to get used to get the advantage. What's cool is that as you fight, you damage your opponent's limbs, so they do less damage and take more. Eventually you can destroy some of them as well, which is a nice touch, though it doesn't happen all that often. I did find that the AI is a little bit all over the place. Some of the characters are incredibly hard to fight, and I would lose constantly on the same couple of opponents, whereas others seem to be quite brain dead. And this didn't seem to matter when you faced them either, so it wasn't like they were easy to start and get harder as you progress. Also, I did find that with some characters I could spam the same move over and over and there was nothing they could do about it. But again, there were other times where I couldn't get a move in edgeways. It was very inconsistent and kind of annoying, to be honest. But the actual fighting, while a little stiff at times, was pretty solid, which, I'll be honest, I didn't expect. The graphics are decent enough for an early game, and it all moves at a good pace and is pretty smooth in terms of animation. It is pretty bare bones with game modes here, with a one-player mode and a versus, and that's all you get. Though that's not really a massive problem in a game like this, though sometimes I do like to check out practice mode so I can learn some of them sweet moves. But overall, this is a fine fighting game. It's not going to blow you away, but you could certainly do worse. Zero Divide apparently did well enough to get a sequel, cunningly titled Zero Divide 2. The game is largely the same, but with a few tweaks here and there. First of all, the graphics and animation are noticeably better, and I actually really like how it all looks. The animation is very smooth and looks even more like Virtua Fighter in the way that everything moves than the first game did. You get 2 extra characters, which isn't a whole lot, but hey, I'll take it. The fighting action is largely the same, with fights taking place in arenas where you can sometimes knock your opponent off them for the win, if smashing them to bits isn't on the cards. But you do have to be careful, as I did find that I threw myself off the level quite a few times here by accident when I was trying to do that. The controls and speed of the game have all been given a noticeable tweak for the better here as well. It feels much more responsive to play and is easier to put together some pretty decent combos, making the fights feel more technical and not just a case of mashing one button over and over. In fact, I didn't even find myself trying to do that here. The limb damage is back and it looks much cooler as you actually see parts of your opponent flying off all over the place. It really makes your attacks feel like they're doing something. There still isn't much in the way of content here, other than a few new characters. There's no funky game modes, but with the really fun fighting and unique roster of characters, this is actually a fighting game that I would recommend checking out. No, it's not going to be better than Tekken or Virtua Fighter, but it is well made and definitely a bit of fun. How about we go over the pond for the last time in this series for a few games that only came out in Japan, possibly. This one is Zutto Issho with Me Everytime. And hooray, it's a visual novel dating sim thing. Oh, how I love these types of games. Now, I can't really tell you too much here, as everything is in Japanese, but it was either this game or a ton of Zoids games, and I know some people like these visual novel dating sims. Sadly, I couldn't make heads nor tails of the story here, but you get to choose from a few girls. I wasn't entirely sure if that's who I was playing as, or if it was the ones that I was going to try and bang. I mean, I'm assuming that's the end game here, right? So I chose from 3 creepily underage looking ladies, and then I skipped through a ton of text. Eventually you get to a calendar screen, and from what I could figure out, you populate this with a range of activities that take place during the day, and then depending on the choices you make, your stats will change. I wasn't really able to tell what any of this did, and I could rarely tell if what I was doing was good or bad. You're given choices all the time, and you have to properly figure out what's going on. This is a game that you can only really play if you're able to read Japanese. It looks decent enough with your standard anime characters and graphics. There's some good animated cutscenes in here, but the majority of the game is all still screens with a bit of animation on the mouths and eyes, but yeah, that's fine. Most of the characters are voiced, which is nice. The game is all menu based, so I guess the controls couldn't be any better, so no complaints there. Overall, I can't of course really tell you anything about this game. It might be terrible, it might be good fun. If you like visual novel dating sim games and can read Japanese, then you might like it. But if not, then there's really no reason to even give it a try. The stupidly named Zill O'll, which I may have said wrong, is an RPG adventure that, once again, is all in Japanese, which is actually a real shame as I had a bit of fun with this one, but just had a hard time getting anywhere because of the language barrier. Here you actually get to create a character, which I'm sure is nicely done, but again I wasn't really able to do much more than get a basic person. Then it appears to be the usual RPG fare with you having to save the land from a big baddie. You start off fighting wheat animals in a forest before exploring a town where people talk a lot, and then you set out with some other characters to do your usual RPG stuff. But I really did enjoy what I was playing, and even though it was very slow progress for me as I never really knew what I was doing or who I needed to talk to or where I needed to go, I was able to get somewhere just by brute forcing it and could figure out what some of the menu bits were for. You do the usual thing of battling to level up, and here you increase your stats, and there's a big emphasis of boosting your magic. Now this could have been down to the character I created, and it might be different depending on who you choose. When you're not in a town, you don't get a bunch of random battles. Instead, you can see the enemies on the map, and you can choose to ignore them if you want to, but you'll want to fight as much as you can to get that sweet XP, and the battles here are really good fun. They're all in 3D, and you choose your attacks, magic or defense for each of your characters, much as you do in any 3D turn-based game. What's nice is that after the battle you have a few seconds of immunity, so you won't immediately go into another battle if you're close to an enemy. You can run past them if you do want to. The graphics here are really cool, and while the characters aren't really the best by any means, the monsters do look decent and the FMV cutscenes are all really fun. It was a real shame that I wasn't able to understand anything that was going on. The controls work fine here, and playing the game is actually easy enough to figure out even if you don't know the language. Again, I can't tell you too much here. I was really hoping to find a translated version of this one, as I did have a good time with it, and I think it's one that I'd like to come back to at some point. Maybe down the line one of the kind translation groups will do that, though there is a hell of a lot of text here to go through. But yeah, if you're able to, I would recommend giving this a go. It seems like a really cool RPG that's fun to play, and has more than a whiff of inspiration from the Final Fantasy games. Here is Zoids, Empire vs Republic. It's a strategy RPG. Now, I've been aware of Zoids for years now, as I used to play Zoids games on my Commodore 64, but I don't really know anything about them. What I do know is that they're a Japanese creation and are giant robot dinosaurs that battle, which is exactly my kind of thing, so it is surprising that I don't know more about Zoids. I guess I was just more of a Dino Riders kid. Anyway, the game here lets you choose from two factions, and then you battle it out with an army of robot dinosaurs in turn-based fashion. The way it works is that before each battle you get to choose your robots that will take part in the mission, with each mission only allowing a certain number of units. Then you're put on a hexagon grid based world where of course each unit can move and attack as much as their stats allow them. So you'll be moving your units around a board looking for the hidden treasure, which is highlighted with a glow at the start of your turn. This gives you free money. Then when you're in range of an enemy, the option to attack appears. Then the game turns into a 3D turn-based battle that looks great. As you'd expect, you choose to attack, defend, run, or a few other things that I couldn't quite figure out, and you battle the other robots to their death. The battles are quite short, but they look great, and each attack has its own animation, which is very nice. When you defeat an enemy, make sure you then use a turn to stand on their corpse, as you'll salvage money from them. Missions are your usual thing of killing everyone else, capturing an enemy base, or surviving a certain number of turns, and they can get quite tricky quite quickly, especially if you're not totally sure what's happening most of the time, like I wasn't. Your units will also level up as you play, dealing more damage and being able to take more. As well as this, between missions you can buy and sell your Zoids, allowing you to get rid of any crappy ones and upgrade to much better ones. You can also kit out the ones that you have with new weapons and armour, so you'll probably find that you'll keep hold of some of the early ones as they'll get pretty damn powerful. You will need to be a certain level to use some of the stuff in the shops as well. There's also a load of intel, map details and other bits of text available, but I couldn't really figure it out. However, I didn't really have too much trouble figuring out most of the menus and was actually able to make a decent bit of progress in this one. And you know what? I had loads of fun doing so. I really enjoyed playing this game and I found it incredibly addictive, and seeing the number of robots available in the shop that I couldn't quite afford made me really want to keep coming back to see what I could buy. Each of the factions has their own units, and of course the bad guys tend to get the cooler ones, but there's T-Rexes, Triceratops, Stegosaurus, Diplodocus and more, just to name a few. The graphics here are decent. Now a lot of it is menus and stills, and the map sections are actually pretty lackluster to be honest, and they even manage to be quite jerky somehow. But the actual robot models look great and I really like the battles. They don't drag on, which is nice, and it all plays at a decent pace. The music here is pretty damn terrible. I'm assuming it's from the anime, but it's only a few really short loops and it starts to drag pretty quickly. But that isn't enough to not make this game fun, and I really enjoyed playing it. This is another one I wish had an English translation. I very rarely play RPGs because I don't have that much time and I can't really get stuck into them, but this is one that I would be very tempted to give a proper go if I could. The last Japan-only game is Zeiramzone, which is another one I may have said wrong. Soz. This is a really cool side-scrolling beat-em-up. I've got no idea what the story is, but you play as a sexy woman that kicks and punches things, and there's evil floating heads that seem to have sent a bunch of strange-looking monsters to do naughty things that deserve a kicking. The game plays mostly on a 2D plane, but at certain points you can use the shoulder buttons to jump between the foreground and background, and in other sections, actually against the bosses, you can actually strafe. This can be where it takes a while to get used to, but it does end up working quite well. There's sections of levels with death pits or obstacles, so you'll be forced to use it sooner or later, but it comes in very handy for dodging enemies. Enemies, of course, come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and there tends to be a fair few on screen at once. It can actually be quite easy to get overwhelmed by them. Thankfully, you have some decent combos. You've got a weak and strong punch and kick, and of course there's access to a few different combos with different combinations of button presses. You also have a few special moves you can do using Street Fighter style inputs. Thanks to the game being on a 2D plane, you press up to jump, but this actually works and makes it easy to do your moves. Now, I will say that the control can be a little stiff, and it's one of those games where you have to wait for animations to finish before you can do anything else. So I did find that I was attacking air or the complete wrong direction a lot of the time, but that's just me being impatient more than anything. Something else I like is that the camera moves around depending on the action and the part of the level you're in, and it can give you some cool angles to watch yourself kicking butt, or having yours kicked if you're not good, like me. Eventually you'll get to a boss, and these fights are really good. You'll need to block by holding away from the enemy and then learn their patterns, as some attacks can't even be blocked. When you beat them, you capture them in some sort of digital cage thing. It's like the game is set inside a computer, which it might be, it's hard to tell. Graphically, the game is decent. It doesn't have a ton of detail, but what's here is good enough, and the enemies are all quite angular, but it looks fine. The levels are nicely designed, and the camera moving around really helps keep things interesting. The controls are decent, they are a little bit stiff, but they work well. You should be able to play this game without any problems. More importantly though, this is a game that you don't need to speak the language to play. It's easy to understand and fun to play. And yes, it's another one that I would recommend. Here is Zanac x Zanac. This is another one of those arcade shooter remakes that were pretty popular on the PS1. So yeah, it's a vertical scrolling shooter where you are a deadly spaceship that is packed to the wings with weapons, but can only take one hit before you die of course, and it's up to you to stop some evil space lords from doing their naughty shiz. As you know, you scroll up the screen, and as you do, waves of enemies will come at you with only one thing on their mind, and that is to kill the hell out of you. You'll need to keep your finger on the attack button while dodging a barrage of bullets, which of course is usually easier said than done. Eventually you'll come to a large boss and the screen will stop scrolling and their obvious weak spot will appear. Shoot it enough times and they'll go boom, with some really cool explosions. Something that I really like here is that there's never a break in the action. Well, there is, but not that often. The game just keeps scrolling onto the next stage of each world while making each one feel pretty big. Now you will move to different planets, so that's when you get the breaks. The levels themselves have the usual feel of space, rocky, fire and grassy things, you know the drill, and they do each have their own enemy types and of course a boss at the end. The length of the level differs though, with some being noticeably shorter than others. You do get a few different weapons here. Each one is represented with a number, which I don't really like in games to be honest, as I have a shit memory and I can never remember which one is which. but if you do collect the same number multiple times, it will power up that weapon and give you more bullets and power. You also get side weapons that work slightly differently. They're slower but have better homing capability or range. These are fun to use. The game looks really good, I reckon, with some really cool sprites, and I love the explosions. It all moves very quickly and the game controls very smoothly and is excellent and responsive. Now, remember at the start when I said this was a remake thingy? Well, that's because it is. And you also have the original arcade games in here. In fact, you've got a few different versions of it. These are fun to play with, and each one is basically the same version of the game, but with a few tweaks to the graphics and difficulty here and there. But the remake is of course the best version by far if you ask me. However, it's always good to have the originals in there just to see where it all started. Overall, this is a decent package. It's a fun shooter that isn't particularly groundbreaking, but it is really fun and quite hard to put down. Unfortunately though, it's really not cheap, so this is one you'll need to play any way you can. Here is the stupidly named Zoboomafoo, and I don't think I said that right, but I'll get over it. It's a 3D platform game for kids, based on what I'm assuming is a pretty popular kids show. Now, even though this is for kids, I do have to admit, I kind of have a soft spot for games like this, mainly because I bloody love animals. There is a story here. It's Lemur Day, and you are Zobu the lemur, and you have to arrange the party, which involves going to find your friends and, more importantly, collect as much food as you can so everyone doesn't get feral on your ass. It's for kids, so it is a very simple game. There's only 5 levels here, and they all play basically exactly the same. You've got an isometric 3D view, and as Zabu you have to explore each stage, which range from jungles, the outback, swamps and tundras, where 50 bits of food are hidden. As well as this, one of your animal mates is also knocking about on the level, and you'll need to find them to invite them to your party. So you'll be looking for an elephant, kangaroo, sea lion and more to get them to the party. To beat each level you have to find your mate and at least 25 of the hidden fruits. So you'll be climbing trees, jumping around ruins or icy tundras and more to do this. Each level also has a ton of other animals in them. Most of these are harmless, but when you go near them you learn some cool fun facts about them, which I really appreciate to be honest. But there's always one type of animal in each level that if you touch them, they'll steal the most recent bit of food that you've collected, which sends it back to its original location, and you have to go back to where you found it to pick it up again. Thankfully, these animals don't really chase you or anything, they just tend to walk in a pattern, so they're quite easily avoided. What's also cool is that you'll need the help of your animal friend in each level to reach some of the fruit, like the kangaroo who can jump really high, or the elephant who you can ride on his back to reach higher places, or even the sea lion who can swim and get the ones out at sea. It's pretty cool. And that really is all there is to the game. It's very simple, but it's for kids, so it makes sense. Surprisingly, the controls are pretty decent, and while I did have a couple of problems with some sections thanks to the perspective, it was never really a problem, and the graphics aren't bad. You get some cool FMV here as well, showing you some of their funky animal facts. And that's about it. Of course, this isn't exactly the best game in the world, but it's an educational title, and for that, it's actually pretty good. And I think that it is a game that kids would have a really good time playing, and might actually learn something. Not like Fortnite. What's that game ever taught anyone? Answers in the comments below. It gets me more views. And finally for today, here is fucking Zoop, or just Zoop as it's normally known. Zoop is one of those games that in the 90s was somehow everywhere. It's on just about every system, and I can remember seeing so many adverts for it, acting like it was the second coming of Jeebus Christie. But what exactly is it? Well, it's a puzzle game, and a pretty simple one, but to be fair, a lot of the best puzzle games are the simple ones. Zoop is all about matching the coloured shapes together to make them disappear before they get to the middle of the screen. To do this, you control an arrow that can only move around the small grid at the centre of the screen. Coloured shapes will slowly move towards you. You can face these shapes and press a button on the controller to shoot out at the shape, and then you turn into that colour of the shape that you've touched, which sounds more complicated than it is. Then you can fire yourself at any other shapes that are the same colour to make them disappear. You go through any shapes that are the same colour as you at that time, but when you touch one of a different colour that might be behind the one that you were shooting at originally, you'll turn into that colour and swap the colour of the shape to whatever colour you were before. So basically it's a game of quick reflexes and colour matching, and as you get more points everything speeds up, and you really have to keep on your toes, looking for ways to get rid of the most colours and making sure that you don't change into a colour that is of no use with no more shapes to get rid of. I've probably made that sound a lot more complicated than it actually is. It's probably just easier to watch the footage. The backgrounds change every now and then and when you hit point milestones, and there's special shapes that appear that let you take out an entire road no matter what colour. These are pretty handy. But that's all there really is to it. It's just a high score game, and it's fine. It will definitely kill a few minutes, but I don't see why there's such a big hubbub around it. I have had this one on the Super Nintendo for longer than I can remember, and it would always be a good one to go to kill a bit of time with. The PS1 version is basically the same. It has slightly better animation, and the music is CD quality, but that's about it. But it's not a bad game. If you like puzzlers, it's a good time waster, but it's not worth more than a tenner if you see it out and about. So there you go, 10 games for the PlayStation 1 that don't often get talked about, starting with the letter Z. As always, make sure you comment below to let me know your favourites, and if there's any more that I could have included. Now, who'd have thought that we'd made it all the way to the end? But wait, who said this was the end? Stay tuned. Now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.